one of the models that we built to forecast the UAE's GDP. We call it the macro model. And for some background, you might want to have a look at our previous sessions. You'll find them on our LinkedIn page and on our website. It'll tell you some background to the project, some sources for the data, and some techniques that we also used uh, outside of the one that we're going to focus on today. So we have 7 or 8 slides and we have 20 or 30 minutes, and we're going to cover this one particular forecasting technique in some detail. And we're going to walk you through some of the results and some of the estimation parameters and the econometrics. If you're interested in more information on the background as well of what GDP is and how it's calculated and what it means, you might be interested in our Eventbrite courses. So check those out on our Eventbrite page. And if you're interested in econometrics or data science, we have some courses as well on Eventbrite that'll help you follow along. But for now, I'll just touch on what this macro model is and why we focus on it today. So this is one of the models that we created for the UAE's GDP forecasting project, and it turns out that it's one of the most accurate models that we have so far. It's based very strongly on economic theory, which we'll get into in the next slide and tell you what we mean by that. And it uses macroeconomic variables to forecast GDP. Last week we talked about another model called ARIMA, and we talked about the fact that that was a theoretical, and it was simply based on its own data series, its own time series, rather than other variables. By contrast, the macro model that we're discussing today is based on multiple variables that should, in economic theory, uh, help us to forecast and predict GDP. We did a lot of academic research to come up with these variables, and we did a lot of data searching, data cleaning, data harmonization to be able to prepare these variables to create this model. And so I'll just hand over to Rodrigo for the following slide to take you through some of the variables that we used for the macro model.
hmm Hello, everyone. So, yeah, we used mainly these 8 variables for our macro model. Um, for those of you who are not too familiar with econometrics or with economics, the economic science, our macroeconomic model is essentially a linear model, multivariate linear model, which means that it establishes a linear relationship between the parameters and the variable of interest, in our case, the change in GDP, the percentage change in GDP, and uses more than one variable to do this estimation, or more than one exogenous variable, as we call the other variables that we are using in the model, um, for this estimation. So of course, the main variable in our model, the change in GDP at constant prices. So we wanted to eliminate the effect of price changes on the variable of interest, especially because we are using inflation as one of the metrics, as one of the variables to estimate our change in GDP. So if we had GDP in current prices, which means that it does not compensated for these changes in prices, the relationship between inflation and our current GDP would likely be a little bit more biased, because naturally, higher inflation means a higher current GDP. That's a um, that's a that's not even a theory. That's just mathematics. But when you look at constant GDP, which means it has been controlled by the price level, then you can establish an economic relationship between inflation and the GDP growth, or the change in GDP. Another factor that we put in as well is total unemployment, also based on the UAE. We use the federal U.S. federal funds effective annual interest rate, so interest rate impacts in GDP. We'll explain a little bit further down why the U.S. Fed funds rate instead of just the UAE interest rate. So We also use gross capital formation, also at current uh, constant prices. That's a little bit of mistype there. We use the Abu Dhabi Industrial Production Index, and then UAE total merchandise and total service exports, and then UAE total merchandise and total service imports, or total exports and total imports. So that's the general data set that we used now for this macro model.
And Rodrigo, just on that, we mentioned these eight variables here, but we tried a lot of other variables, didn't we, before we arrived at these eight.
Yeah. So as PJ mentioned before, we did a extensive research in the academic literature, as well as what it was practiced in other institutions, IMF, central banks, World Bank. Because of course every place has their different model, has a different set of variables, and we wanted to use the best practices of that we can find to get to the best result possible. So we did try other variables as well. We started, I think, well, our original data set, as we mentioned in previous sessions, had over 500 variables. For the estimation of total GDP, I believe we started in around 20 variables. And then we just did an iteration process, testing through them. Um, some of them were not significant at all, so we just excluded them. Some of them they were statistically significant, but then after we later on, after further testing, understood that they were significant, but that's also that didn't mean that they actually had a causation relationship in there, or an actual correlation. They were what we call a spurious regression, which means they seem to be correlated, but in reality they are not. So we did have to do an iteration process to select the best variables and to make sure that the variables we selected were actually correlated with GDP in actuality, and not just spuriously correlated.
Yeah, yeah, and it's fair to say there was probably some variables that we were looking for that we couldn't quite get good information on, but we did get good information on these ones, and they did help us create a really good model.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So for each of the variables, since we were leaving from economic theory, well, our starting point was economic theory. Naturally, we had some expectations on how they should behave regarding in regards to GDP. Of course, this expectation was not only for economic theory, but also from what we observed in other studies using real world data. So even though these expectations were not the definitions, they didn't define how we use those variables. They were sort of a guide for us to see, okay, if this variable is performing as expected, then does that mean it's a good variable, or is that uh, you know it seems we're in the right direction? Let's just make sure this is the right direction. Whereas if there was an unexpected relationship that we found, then we just dove in into more detail to see, okay, why is this relationship not going as expected? Is the literature pointing towards a different way, or does it mean that we are not accounting for another variable that we should be accounting for in our model? So that this expectation on the behavior of the variables was more like a guideline to how we would treat the variable after the model was estimated. So just giving it a quick rundown through it. So inflation rates tends to move along with economic activity, but also when you look at long periods of high inflation rates, it tends to correlate negatively with GDP. That's because in periods of higher activity, higher GDP, the prices tend to get a little bit higher as well, because the economy is a bit more. The economy is going stronger. People are spending more. People are earning more. So the prices tend to behave to accompany that movement. In terms of the lagged negative relationship that we mentioned there, it's because again in periods of high inflation, especially if it's continuous high inflation, um, consumers tend to be more careful about how they spend their money, since the usually high inflation corrodes our purchasing power, and so we might be more willing to, let's say, try to find investments that will keep our purchasing power and try to avoid consuming. And then, of course, there's also the fact that for a lot of people, in periods of high inflation, they just lose their purchasing power. So something that they would be able to buy, let's say last year, after high inflation, this year they won't be able to buy anymore. So they won't buy it, and this money then will not will be reflected in the overall performance of GDP this year. So that's the root of our expectations. Um, just to clarify something as well here, when we say concurrent, we mean in the same period. So this positive relationship would be in the same period, and then the lagged or uh, relationship would be one period affecting the next period. In terms of unemployment, if you're familiar with economic theory, there is the Phillips curve that mentions about the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So periods of high inflation tend to have lower unemployment and vice versa. So since there exists a relationship as well, um, we thought that these two variables could complement each other in our model. There's also the fact, of course, that unemployment itself is affected by and affects GDP performance. Again, periods of higher economic activity tends to have lower employment because the economy is producing more. You need to hire more people to keep up with production. More people being hired means more people consuming, and then you have this virtuous cycle that happens in the economy. So that's where you find this positive concurrent relationship. And then in terms of a lagged relationship, you tend to have as well this negative effect, because if you don't have a job today, and maybe well, let's say in a period of high unemployment, people are also more careful in terms of consuming, because they're not sure if the ones that have a job are not sure if they're going to be able to keep their jobs, and the ones that don't have jobs, of course, don't really have money to keep on consuming. And then after following a period of high unemployment, it takes a while for this sense of insecurity to ease out. So sometimes if you stay, for example, a year or two unemployed, and then you find a job, uh, it's likely that you're not going to start consuming right away. You're going to wait for a little bit until you're more stabilized in your current position, and then you're going to increase your consumption, or maybe you're going to start paying off debt that you acquired during your period of unemployment, and then you're going to begin consumption. So there are many ways in which you have this negative effect that is also lagged within GDP. So if I was unemployed yesterday, this can still affect my behavior today, especially in terms of consumption. So that's where this expectation of a lagged effect come, as well as of course this effect at the same period. In terms of the interest rates, that's also very largely agreed upon economic effect. That's how every central bank operates, which is higher interest rates tend to correlate to negative GDPs. Um, central bank increases interest rates, that will tend to slow down economic activity by one, making loaning money more expensive, so it tends to reduce consumption. And then on the other side, tends to also reduce investment, because now you need to have a better return on investments to be able to to be no, well, to be able to pay off the loans that you're taking for this investment, but also for the investment itself to be worth it undertaking. So that's why this negative relationship is expected. And as well, if you look at the literature on the impact of interest rates, everywhere you're going to find either between usually they say between 12 and 24 months, the lagged effect on interest of interest rates on the economy. That's usually due to contracts, and how these contracts work. So essentially, if a central bank increases their interest rates today, it's expected that this impact on the economy will start only the year after. So that's why we expected only a lagged negative effect on of interest rate on GDP. Gross capital formation is a component of GDP, is a part of the investment component of GDP. So naturally, on that, you have a positive effect. But then there's also a positive lagged effect on the economy, since on a period of high gross capital formation, uh, essentially, well, gross capital formation is essentially money being invested in the economy for the construction of, let's say, factories or buying machines. So all of that gross capital formation is going to become installed production capability. So if you have a higher um, production capability, that also gives way for a higher production level and therefore a higher GDP. So that's why not only we expect the gross capital formation to have a positive relationship to current GDP, being a component of it, but also to future GDP, since you already have this capacity installed, that it's going to be operating and generating um, economic output throughout the years. Uh, then we come to the industrial production index. Again, industry is also it's a sector, the manufacturing sector more specifically, to which industry is a part of GDP, is a sector of GDP. So of course, naturally there comes a concurrent positive relationship with there. Um, but why did we choose the industry industrial production index instead of any other economic sector? We did try the utility sector as well, electricity consumption on our model, but the industry is very closely related to many other sectors. A lot of what's produced in industry is used, for example, in agriculture. It's used in retail, the retail sector. It's used in the construction sector. So uh, periods of high activity in the industry tend to correlate as well with higher activity in other sectors of the economy. So that's why, well, we included in the model. It tends to have a, let's say, more than one for one impact in the economy. So a period of higher, let's say, let's say one currency unit higher operation of the industry will tend to relate to a more than one currency higher GDP. So that's why we included in the model as well. And then total imports and exports, again, also a component of GDP. Um, but their relationship to GDP may also have a um, a different look than just looking at the at how they impact directly on the calculation of GDP. You have the net exports, which are the exports minus the imports. That's the GDP components that we see when we calculate through the expenditure approach. But then we also have total trade, which is something that might have um, more predictive power over GDP than the net exports itself. Why is that? Because let's say you have an economy that's going very strongly, you have very high exports and then very high imports as well. You have a population with a lot of money that's importing a lot of consumer products. You're going to have a net exports that are close to zero. However, your total trade is going to be very, very large. And then that can be followed by a downturn period, let's say, where our exports are still going fairly well, but because there's a lot of unemployment, people are buying less, our imports go down a lot. Then you have a high net export, but your total trade will be much lower. So even though you have a high net export, you can say, okay, then that means the economy is going well. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So to be able to account for both of these possible relationships, that's why we included total imports and total exports also as separate factors, not just put together. And again, the expectation is that we have a positive relationship, especially when we talk about total trade and GDP.
Very good, Rodrigo. Yeah, thank you for that. And it's fair to say that some of these variables we were explicitly collecting with the expectation, because they're quite closely related to the GDP calculation itself, that
Hmm.
they should really help us. We were following the mathematics, weren't we, and trying to pick up these variables. But which of these variables would you say did we expect to have the strongest relationship? I'll share the one that I thought was going to
Hmm.
be quite strong, but which ones did you think were going to be the strongest and the weakest out of these targets?
Hmm. Well, my expectation, I think, on the strongest one would be the interest rates, because that's usually one of the base ones. What that, general macroeconomics is based upon. That's why it's the one that, we have in a whole institution to control it, which are the central banks. So I expect that one to be the strongest one. In terms of the weakest one, probably the total trade, because they are more of an indicator of how the economy is going than exactly how a big impact on how the economy is going necessarily. So uh,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and I had the same on the strongest one. I also had the interest rate was sort of front and center of my mind as well, for the same sorts of reasons that this is controls the cost of money and everything then can flow from that, from the corporate sector to the personal sectors as well. And
Mhm.
this is obviously what theory would tell us and what the central banks do very actively, proactively trying to manage economies. The ones that I thought might have been the weakest were actually, in my mind, maybe the inflation or the unemployment. But I'll tell you why. Because we're talking about the UAE, and we're talking about, for from the inflation standpoint, the fact that there was potentially a positive or negative, and I thought that those two could just offset each other, and then the results wouldn't be as strong, you know. So I wasn't sure where inflation would actually land for us, and then for unemployment, because we're talking about the UAE, I wasn't just sure how whether it would be as strong as some of the other economies like America and the United Kingdom in terms of the relationship between the data and between the data for unemployment and the data for GDP, because
Mhm.
usually everyone that comes to UAE has a job, and that's quite hard to be here if you don't have a job in the UAE. So for all sorts of reasons, I just thought that link between the unemployment data and the GDP data would not be as strong. But that was just a preconception. But it was nice to actually test it and let the numbers reveal for us
Mhm.
whatever they. Yep.
Oh yeah, that's a very fair assumption, and I would say that's also one of the advantages of working in this type of doing this type of work from within the region, instead of just trying to estimate from far away. Because my perspective, again, is the theoretical perspective from an economist, which that's where we see the relationship. But like, you have the knowledge, let's say you have the inside knowledge of being in the UAE and knowing how that economy operates up close. So that would say it's also, it showcases this advantage of being inside, when doing these estimations.
Yep. Yep. And then we mentioned the interest rate being the Fed's fund rate, which is the American one. And then on this slide, number 5, you're going to tell us a bit about why that's the case.
Yeah. So of course, when we estimate a model, especially a forecasting model, we want to have as much data as possible, as many observations as possible, so that we can establish the relationships that are closest to, the truth as possible. Um, so we favor variables with more observations over variables with less observations. Now, we didn't have that many observations for the overnight EBOR, which is the overnight interest rates of the UAE, due to the fact that they don't they started collecting it much later than, let's say, the US. Compared to the US, the US has a much longer series that would be able to use. And since their currency, the UAE currency is pegged to the US dollar, it it's very we saw that it was very likely that those two interest rates would have to operate very closely, because if otherwise, if they didn't operate very closely, they wouldn't be able to peg their currency to the US. So that's why we decided to explore this relationship and see if we could use the US data. As you can see here, there's a almost 100%. There's a 99 r square. It's about a 98% correlation between the UAE and the USA interest rates, as we expected. So using that, we decided to go with the Fed funds rate for the
Mm.
estimation of the model.
And whenever this is why you've got a table that shows 42 observations for IBOR and 82 for Fed's funds rate. And what you're saying there is there was just more data for the Fed's funds rate, even
Yeah,
though the chart above just correlates 42 observations from both. I think.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Very good, very
for the correlation, we had to use the same amount of observations for both variables because that's how the
good.
type of analysis work. But we of course extrapolated the relationship for the remaining periods that we had information for the federal funds, but did not have information for the
Hmm.
UAE interest rate.
Yeah, and it's a good example as well of the fact that being aware of that local knowledge and the currency and the theory about why the two interest rates would be very, very closely aligned. And we just saw that last week actually when there was a change in interest rate in
Hmm.
both the US and the UAE of similar magnitudes. Very, very closely related in terms of time, as we expected. So, one of the other things to mention here is that in data science, sometimes we're asked how do we backfill, how do we deal with missing information, which is a huge challenge, especially for regions like the UAE. And so this is a really good example where if you use economic theory to help you with the missing information, you'll have a better data set and a better model in the end, a more robust model, not just statistically, but also, yeah, theoretically robust as well. And some data scientists would just backfill using the average or just backfill using some other crude measure. But we think this is where when you have a really good grip on the fundamentals of GDP and the economics, it can really help with your with your forecasting and with your data science techniques as well. So this is a good example of backfilling with a good with a really good technique rather than just a simple off the shelf book technique.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And then we're going to talk through the resulting model then that we ended up with.
Hmm. So yeah, so we ended up with this resulting model. It's not really there's no reason to go number by number, but what's important here is to look at the signs of each of the coefficients that we have calculated and how they relate to the variable that we calculated. And here we can see that our expectations on the variables were sort of spot on. Um, we did find a positive relationship between inflation and GDP, and a negative lagged relationship between inflation and GDP. Um, in terms of unemployment, we also find a negative relationship with the current unemployment and current GDP. What surprised us a little bit was the positive lagged relationship between unemployment and GDP. We did come up with a few possible explanations for that, but of course, further studies would be necessary to make a well-based assumption, a more empirical assumption on that, not assumption, but assertion. Sorry, on this relationship. So here is given the fact that this relationship between unemployment and GDP would be a 2 year lagged effect. So let's say for 2022, that would have been 2021 unemployment. There are a few possible explanations for that. One of them, for example, would be that during a period of unemployment, some people have to um, find other ways to earn money to maintain their life, maintain their lifestyle, or just their life in general. So that could lead to a path of exploration of entrepreneurship on f- from some of those people, and that entrepreneurship, of course, would not yield results immediately. You would not see a few people starting their own small businesses directly impacting the economy for a while until these companies had some more maturing, and that's where 2 years after we would find this effect on the economy. As we can see here, it's not a very large impact. It's 0.18. It's not so it's not really a lot of a huge change in the economy, but that's one of the possible explanations that we have found for this unexpected relationship. But again, a deeper dive, a deeper study on it would have to be done. PJ already mentioned some insights on how the unemployment in the UAE works, so that could also be a factor. Um, a period of higher unemployment means that a little bit afterwards, some people had to leave the country because their visas expired. They didn't have any more time to find work, so that could also have impacted the unemployment rate. That could have also generated a positive correlation in GDP and employment rate. So there are some other factor here that we can have to account for. In terms of the interest rates, again, nothing unexpected. Negative relationship between interest rates and GDP. What maybe was a bit unexpected was the size of the impact. Um, the coefficient here was not amongst the largest ones, but um, that can also mean simply because we didn't have that many very big variations of interest rates compared to variations in other variables like gross capital formations, industrial production, etc. Industrial production, again, positive relationship. We did expect more of a current impact um, of industrial production on GDP, but we found actually a lagged impact. Um, doesn't diverge that much from economic theory. That just means that the increases in the industrial activity tend to be seen with more effect on future GDP. When we were estimating, we did try to eliminate the industrial production variable, the second leg, and just include the current industrial production. And we did have also a statistically significant variable, but it was just not as good in terms of explanatory power as the lagged variable. So that's why we decided to keep the lagged one instead of the current one. If we included both variables, then that included a bias in our model because they moved quite similarly, and so we just decided to eliminate the current one and keep the better variable in there. Um, Gross capital formation, again, positive impact. Lagged effect more that was stronger. Nothing surprised here as we were expecting. And then exports and imports as well. Not very far off. Um, we did try as well, for example, net exports and then total trade, but in the end, putting those two variables separately oops, ended up in a better model than putting them together.
Yeah, yeah, and were all of these statistically significant, Rodrigo? It's maybe worth having a maintaining
Yeah,
something on that.
yeah. So all variables here as a set were statistically significant. When we looked at imports and exports by themselves, they were not statistically significant, which means that there was a hint that maybe we could eliminate one of those two to the model. But as is the case with sometimes it's the case with multivariate models, you can have one variable or two variables that move relatively close together, and so when you include both of them, they will not be individually significant, but jointly, which means when we take the two of them together, they are statistically significant. So what we found is that if we eliminate just exports or just imports, our model would lose a lot, um, or it would lose a significant amount of explanatory power. So it would make our model worse. And taking the two out altogether would also make our model worse. So we performed some tests on statistical significance, and we found that these two variables are jointly significant, even though individually, when you look at their t statistics, they're not individually significant.
Yep, and it's fair to mention as well that the subscripts T and T minus one and T minus two, and you can see a mix of different subscripts here because what we were doing was trial and error a little bit and
Hmm.
trying the current the T year numbers and seeing if those were leading to the change. We were also trying T minus one and T minus two. I'm not sure if we went as far as T minus three and so on, but we were definitely mixing everything, trial and everything to see what was the strongest relationship that we could find in the strongest predictive model as well. And it's fair to
Hmm.
say as well, I think Rodrigo, wasn't it, that these are all growth numbers. So this is the change in GDP growth, um, and the other variables are also the change in their growth series.
Yes, yeah. So it's changing GDP, changing inflation, changing unemployment rates. All those changes, of course, were made um, to avoid spurious regressions, to make our series stationary. So we're dealing with data series. We need to make sure that they're stationary. They're not moving with trend line, because that's what could yield a spurious model. Again, if you want to learn a bit more, I know we've been using some terms here that are a bit more technical. So if you want to learn more, we do have a series of courses in econometrics on our Eventbrite that you can check it out and learn more about what exactly is statistical significance, what exactly is stationarity, differencing, all of those things.
Yep, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions as well. But then we can maybe finalize on the characteristics of the model and the final results, Rodrigo.
Hmm. Yeah, so just a quick glimpse here. We had a higher accuracy model considering the ones that we were comparing to. Our MAE, or mean average error, was around 3%, so that was a good a good level. As you may recall from our first session, the IMF, for example, had a model that had an MAE of 5%, so that was a big difference. Our REMA model had an MAE that was a little bit larger, was 3.12 if I'm not mistaken, so fairly close, but still a bit better. We did prefer this model over the ARIMA, which again was very close, because this one allowed for the scenario-driven projections. So if we wanted to, for example, explore how would the GDP perform under a higher inflation rate or under a higher unemployment, something like that, we could do these changes in scenario and see how GDP would behave. So that's why we preferred this model. And then, of course, since we're dealing with a linear model that has these exogenous variables that explain the dependent variable, which means all these variables explaining GDP. To do the forecasting, we had to do some assumptions on these variables, uh, because of course we don't know how they are going to be in the future. So we tried a few different assumptions. We tried running autoregressive models or REMA models for each of the exogenous variables. Um, we tried this assumption that we ended up going with, which is that they each follow their 5-year average moving average. We also tried running different models for each of the exogenous variables to see if the um, forecast from those models being used for our forecast would generate a better result or not. In the end, the better results that we found were you with these exogenous variables go, performing this 5-year moving average.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
very good. That's a nice
So
summary, and
yeah.
yep.
So just if I might add, if we want that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the best assumption for all of these variables. More, it's possible that if we keep looking at different assumptions, it could be the case, for example, that just the period that we did the forecasts for these variables behaved in that way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to behave that way in the future. Um, that's also a possibility that we do take into account when we try our models. Um, so it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the best assumption for all the exogenous variables. But given that our goal was not only to find the best possible GDP model, but to find the best possible GDP model that was also sort of efficient in terms of costs, in terms of maintenance. Uh, we prefer using that assumption. We could, for example, change our assumptions, maybe use a different assumption for each of the variables, each of the exogenous variables, and we might find even better results in terms of forecasting. But yeah, this one was the one that we found had the more consistent, gave us the best consistency, and was also cost efficient in terms of calculation.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Excellent. Okay, that takes us to the end of the session. And thanks very much for joining us today or watching this back on repeat. And feel free to look at the other materials that we mentioned from previous weeks and on Eventbrite. And feel free to reach out. We've got our contact details here. If you've any questions, just reach out. We noticed that yesterday, and one of the reasons why that we were running this series, we were waiting on other information becoming available during September, and just yesterday, the UAE central bank published forecasts of GDP for 2024 and 2025. I think it is 20. They're forecasting 4% growth for 2024 and 6% for 2025. So we did a quick comparison and we found that our ARIMA model that we mentioned last week would forecast actually higher growth for 2024, 4.4%. I think it is looking for us at the minute. And for 2025, I think it's forecasting lower growth than 6%. I think we're getting about 4.6%. But we can dive into that in a bit more detail, and we can do more comparisons of for our forecast and other sources of GDP forecast. We did one of those, I think, last week as well, and we showed that it was more accurate compared to the AMF, the forecast that we had. But we can do that, and we do plan to do that in a future session. So keep an eye out for that. We might do that next week actually, um, to compare our models and the latest forecast that we have with the latest forecast from the UAE central bank and the latest forecast from the IMF as well. So that'll give people a sense of where we think the GDP is going for the UAE and how that compares to those other sources of forecast that are right there. So keep an eye out for that and keep an eye out for any future sessions. But I think for now, we'll just leave it there. Thanks very much. And as I say, get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks.